How many of you know somebody as an adult person who's narcissistic, but you know their backstory and you know that as a child, they were super valued for this thing they did. They were a great soccer player, or they were a great spelling bee person, or I don't know, they were a ballerina or something, and that's what they were valued for. They were a performer, or almost like a performing pony, and the parents was really kind of only liked them because they did that. And you can see in their adult narcissism, you can see that the reason a lot of that came from this parent who really only loved them conditionally. Drop it in the comments if you did, because that's what this video is about. This is a new series we're doing on how we manage the origins of a person's narcissism in our life, right? The origins of what they've been through. Their behavior is bad now, but how knowing their backstory affects how we make justifications, how we interact with them, and even sometimes how we blame ourselves. So in this video, we're taking on when you're in a relationship with somebody who has this kind of performing pony backstory to their narcissism. And before I get to that, I am Dr. Ramani. This is a YouTube channel on narcissism and toxic relationships and difficult situations in general. It's my hope that what you learn on this channel will help you better cope with these relationships so you can heal and ideally avoid them in the first place. If you're new to this channel, please join us by subscribing. If you happen to like this video, give it a thumbs up. If you don't want to, that's okay too. Thank you again for that, though. So let's talk about this. Let's talk about this performing pony narcissism and what it does to us. So again, in this series, the hope is that one of our big struggles is justification in these relationships, right? We justify. And part of those justifications come from knowing a narcissistic person's backstory. This kind of narcissism, the sort of performing pony backstory, is a tough one, right? So, like I said, you may know a narcissistic person who in childhood was valued for putting on a show. Maybe they were the pageant kid, or the soccer star, or the spelling bee champ, or the chess whiz, or the child actor, or the virtuoso musician. Now, please keep in mind, not all, in fact, I'd say most children who go deep into these really publicly performative spaces as children, most of them don't turn out to be narcissistic adults. Many kids in these spaces actually felt very supported in what they were doing. They wanted to do it. They felt that their parents had good boundaries, and they knew that they were loved, whether they did it or not, or whether they won or lost, whether they got the part or not, and that these activities were an important and healthy part of their childhood. That's not what we're talking about here. We're not talking about that healthy version. This is about the children who were loved largely because they performed and made their parents look good. When you think about it, it's really quite sad that these are children who knew that the only way that they were going to get this much time with the parent or love or regard from the parent was because they did the thing and excelled at the thing that the parent wanted them to do. The parents got validation from their child's performances and successes and would yammer on and on and on about their children and basically turn their child into their entire social and validation universe. The child's performance became a source of narcissistic supply, and so were all the trappings around it. And the parent would often sit there and drink in the adulation of their child or their children's success, but however would also potentially be quite cruel if the child did not perform or win the way they wanted. You need only sit on the sidelines of a high-end child's sports match to see these performing pony-type parents pressuring and shaming their children. And I know when I witnessed this when I had younger children, I would just want to go up to these people and tell them to please stop and find their own damn lives and stop getting identity from their children and just love their kids. But I didn't do that, partly because I'm afraid of conflict, but partly because my child would have actually been furious if I embarrassed her that way. So let's say you know that this is the backstory, this performing pony thing is the backstory about the narcissistic person in your life, that they lived that ultimate experience in conditional love, that if you get on the top team, we love you. If you win the pageant, we love you. If you get the big spelling bee trophy, we love you. If you don't, well, we're not feeling you so much. And while they may pay lip service to, yeah, of course I love you still, the parent's disappointment would be written all over the face. The parents might even withdraw at those times. Now, narcissistic people who have this performing pony backstory are very concerned as adults by success and appearances. The vast majority of people raised this way who don't want to do the thing or be the thing that the parent expects of them may also do other things, including rebel or keep doing the activity despite the toll it is taking on them, or do it but not be good enough. And they don't become narcissistic. They may have very difficult relationships with those demanding and conditional parents, but they may be quite anxious and still feel they have to earn love, but they don't become narcissistic. In some cases, children with these kinds of parents may feel guilty that their parent did put so much time in or money in or did so much, and they may either end up sort of being disgusted with the parent, but they also have a lot of self-blame and view themselves as a bad person for viewing their parents through that lens. But for the narcissistic folks who do have this sort of performing pony origin to their narcissism, these are often folks who end up being grandiose or communal narcissistic adults. The narcissistic people who have this performing pony backstory had parents who actually were very involved, I would say even too involved, which is why we don't tend to see as much of the malignant and vulnerable narcissists here. It's not that backstory of neglect we tend to see with those types of narcissism. To the world, these are children who look like they had deeply involved parents who were around all the time and probably even too much, and were intrusive and didn't allow their children to individuate and develop their own interests, or even let them deviate from this activity that was so important to the parent. But these parents derive their identity from their child. And the children who evolve into narcissistic personalities from this backstory often do not get to develop an ego that is connected to anything but their performative self. They don't get to develop as a person with feelings and subjective experiences. Their identity is as a soccer star, a baseball star, a ballerina. The idea of them as an individual person with feelings and other experiences was secondary to that identity. And that is often the curse of narcissism, that these are people that are defined by a superficial identity rather than as a fully formed person with an emotional core. One of the core deficits of narcissism is that the narcissistic person's identities are determined by what they believe other people want of them, by what will get them validation. They set goals from a place of grandiosity, what looks good rather than what they want, because they don't know what they want. That doesn't get shaped, especially with this performing pony story. People with this kind of origin of narcissism, like I said, are about appearances, are often one-trick ponies, pun intended. They'll talk about their childhood or adolescent achievements, even if they're out of date. There's, again, a lot of superficiality, a lot of achievement orientation, and often run the risk of doing the same thing to their own children because they may not connect the dots on what all of this conditional performance, way they were raised, what it did to them. So if you are in a relationship with someone who has this performing pony backstory, it can be frustrating and vapid and exhausting. You may feel that it is always them who's doing the show, and you always have to clap as though they were a 6-year-old cartwheeling through the living room. Their chronic need for attention and validation will also be taxing. As with all of these origin stories, knowing where it comes from can play on the trauma bond and also lead to justification. And you can fall into the pattern of cutting them slack because you feel bad for the conditional parental love that they came from. In a way, this kind of relationship, if you're with somebody who has this backstory, can feel like you're indulging a child. If you're co-parenting with someone with this backstory, they may get caught up in the same intergenerational cycle of pushing this child and defining your child together by whatever activity that they want them to do. And you may need to step in and advocate for your children. Now, if you had a parent like this who tried to do this to you, they may very well have tried to pull this entire performing pony cycle on you. And if you resisted, you would feel the harsh sting of them dissing you for not wanting to do or excel at whatever thing they wanted you to do. Most children want time with their parents or their parents' approval and may really knock themselves out to excel at what the parent wants them to excel at. And this can be quite painful if you don't quite have an affinity for that activity or an interest in it. And having a parent with this kind of backstory, so it happened to your own parent, can be very painful if you don't perform the way you want to. In fact, the golden child scapegoat dynamic in a situation like this may emanate from the golden child being good at what the performing pony narcissistic parent wants, and the scapegoat not being able to do that. So that can actually create that dynamic within a family. If you have someone in your life with this backstory, they may very well view relationships as transactional. Well, if I do this thing, then I will succeed, and I may expect this of others, which feels awful if you aren't interested in hoop jumping as a form of love. So if you do, again, have someone in your life that has this sort of, again, performing pony backstory, what I'm calling it, you can call it sort of this very performative, conditional kind of place that they came from. The key is to understand, yeah, you get where it came from, but if you really do feel that your relationship is transactional, or that there's a conditionality that you have to hoop jump to keep their love, and that they insist on hoop jumping in all relationships, and for them it really is that as long as they're performing, then they can get away with other behaviors, which is often what their parents did to them. It can be very, very confusing because, like I said, you might say, oh, they're just repeating what they saw in childhood, and that's true. That's actually not unusual in narcissistic personalities. The question is whether you want to sit there for years or even decades waiting for them to work it through, which is going to be real hard to do if they're not in therapy. So while these relationships may be entertaining for a minute because they're always showing off that thing they can do, after a while you might find yourself getting bored and frustrated and having none of your needs met at all in this relationship. Thanks again.